Have you ever stopped to think about why we actually like being scared? I mean, why do we willingly curl up with a book or sit in a dark theater just to let monsters chase us through our imagination? Well, it turns out those creatures we love to fear are way more than just cheap thrills. They're actually a reflection of us, a mirror to our deepest collective anxieties. So, let's dive in.
So really, what is it about horror that gets us hooked? The answer is pretty cool, actually. Our monsters are never just monsters. They're metaphors. They're the physical shape we give to our biggest, most abstract fears. From political paranoia to social pressures, horror stories have always been the place where we give our anxieties a face so that we can finally, look them in the eye.
And you want a perfect example of this? Look no further than the Cold War. It was an entire era defined by this massive, invisible, wall-to-wall fear. So what kind of monster could possibly embody that level of dread? Well, enter the vampire.
Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. The exact same monster meant two completely different things depending on which side of the Iron Curtain you were on. In the West, Dracula was first seen as this sanguinary capitalist, a greedy aristocrat literally draining the life from the working class. Then, as the Red Scare kicked in, our monsters became alien invaders, basically communists in disguise coming to destroy the American way. But you hop over to the East, totally different story. Over there, the vampire was a threat from within. It was the ghost of an old tyrant like the Tsar, or even the oppressive cult of personality around Stalin, a living corpse feeding on their new society.
And this split, it went all the way down to how they even thought about horror as a genre. Soviet critics would look at Western horror films and just see this pointless, self-indulgent obsession with one person's psychology. For them, a monster wasn't about some private little nightmare. No, it had to be a threat to the collective, a problem for the whole society.
And I mean, they took these metaphors really seriously. Check out this quote. It's not from some government memo or a political speech. It's from a science fiction novel written by a Bolshevik revolutionary. He frames a vampiric invasion not as some simple good versus evil story, but as a chillingly logical choice. He's basically arguing that a higher form of life can't be sacrificed for a lower one. It's ideology turned into pure horror. Pretty wild, right?
All right, so let's shift gears. We've talked about these huge geopolitical fears, but what about anxieties that are a little closer to home? Like, literally, in the home. For the author Shirley Jackson, the most terrifying place on earth wasn't some spooky castle in Transylvania. Nope, it was a quiet house in suburban America.
So to really get why Jackson is such a genius, you gotta know about this genre called the female gothic. For centuries, these stories had a pretty set formula, right? A young woman gets trapped in a creepy house by some villainous guy. It was a metaphor for being trapped by society, but the key thing is, she almost always got out in the end, usually by marrying a good guy.
But then Shirley Jackson came along and just flipped the whole script. She basically asked, yeah, but what if there is no way out? This quote here from one of her own memoirs just captures her whole vibe perfectly. In her stories, the heroines don't escape the house. They just decide to live there.
And she was tapping into something so real for her time. In the 1950s, women were pushed into this idealized but super isolating domestic role. The feminist Betty Friedan would eventually give this feeling a name, the problem that has no name. Well, Shirley Jackson gave it a name too. She called it a haunted house.
And this leads to her absolute masterstroke. In her books, like The Haunting of Hill House, the monster isn't some ghost rattling chains in the attic. The true bone-deep horror is that the female characters, trapped and isolated, start to merge with the house itself. They become the ghosts, haunting the hallways of their own lives. You see, the monster isn't in the house is the monster.
Okay, so if vampires reflected Cold War paranoia and haunted houses were all about domestic dread, that brings us to today. What are we scared of right now? To find out, we don't have to look very far. Let's do a little pulse check by looking at a discussion from the horror literature community over on Reddit.
So when you look at the books that horror readers are most excited for, you start to see some really clear patterns. First up, there's this fascination with what we can call cultural gothic, things exploring historical identity. Then you've got a ton of buzz for cosmic dread, stories about these huge forces that are way beyond our control. And then there's a massive interest in social commentary, books that tackle everything from digital crimes to controversial online subcultures. And finally, you see this recurring theme of revisited trauma, stories that stare right into our personal wounds.
Okay, so we've got the categories. We see what people are reading, but what does it all mean? What are the deep down fears that these new monsters are bringing to life?
Well, when you break it down, it's pretty much a map of our modern anxieties. Cultural Gothic, that's us wrestling with history and identity in a globalized world. Cosmic Dread, that's our feeling of powerlessness against things like climate change or huge political shifts. Technosocial horror, that's our fear of the internet, social media, and all the dark corners that come with it. And revisited trauma, that shows this deep need we have right now to finally confront old wounds, both personal and collective, that have been ignored for too long.
And this brings us full circle, right back to where we started. It doesn't matter if it's a political vampire or a psychological haunted house, our monsters always serve this vital purpose. They aren't just there to scare us, they're reflections. They're here to show us what we're truly afraid of.
So here's the takeaway. The whole function of fear broken down into 3 simple steps. Step 1, a society gets anxious about something big and abstract. Step 2, horror comes along and gives that anxiety fangs or claws or turns it into a house that won't let you out. It makes the fear real. And step 3, by facing that monster in a story, we get to face our actual fear, but, from the safety of our couch. It lets us process it and maybe even understand it a little better.
So the next time you pick up a scary book or turn on a horror movie, ask yourself, what is this really about? What's the fear behind the monster? Because the stories that are scaring us the most today, they're giving us a sneak peek at the anxieties that are going to shape our world tomorrow. And that leaves us with one final haunting question. When you look at the world around you right now, what monster do you see taking shape?